Guys, this video picks up where the last video took off. As you may recall, in the last video we were talking about the French and Indian War, and we were saying about how because of the war, the British started to impose new taxes on the colonists get angry, and then they're going to end up declaring independence, and that's going to be the whole Revolutionary War. All right, so when the colonists decide to declare independence from Britain, they wrote a document. You can think of it as the breakup letter, and the document is called, oddly enough, the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration starts out, it says things like, it starts off saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the whole point of the Declaration of Independence, the point of those words is, this is basically telling England, these are all the reasons why we are declaring independence. We want to get away from you because you don't give us. You're not protecting our life. You're not protecting our liberty. We're not free to pursue happiness, and so on and so forth. So like I said, the Declaration of Independence, that's basically what the point is of that letter. Anyway, as you know, I hope you know, that America won the Revolutionary War. And so naturally, we have to form a new country, and we need a brand new government. We're not going to be part of England anymore, so we now need a new American government. So we need to create rules for this government, and these rules are going to be written in a different document, and that document that has the rules for our government is called the Constitution. All right, so when you think of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, you should know that both of these documents take a lot of ideas and inspiration from the European Enlightenment. All right. For example, the social contract theory from John Locke. John Locke was the one who said that all people have natural rights. They are their life, liberty, and property, which should sound familiar. I just said that the Declaration of Independence said you're entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, they basically stole it from John Locke. Anyway, but another thing John Locke said, in addition to the whole natural rights thing, one of the things John Locke said was that the power and authority for a government comes from the people. So the government has a duty to protect life, liberty, and property. And if the government doesn't do that, the people have the right to overthrow the government. So he really came out and he was big on saying that, again, authority comes from the people, that the power from the government comes from the people. In addition to John Locke, there's also another Enlightenment thinker you should remember. His name was Montesquieu. Montesquieu was big because he came up with the idea of separation of powers. And that's also a really important idea that goes into the Constitution. So this is another way the Enlightenment thinkers really influenced America. So you should remember that the federal government is split up, for example, into three branches. We have a legislative, executive, judicial branch. And again, that ties back into Montesquieu's theory, that Montesquieu said, if you concentrate the power in one person, there will be tyranny. To protect people from tyranny, and what tyranny means is, when you live under tyranny, means you don't have freedom. So he says, to protect people from tyranny, we need separation of powers. Okay, you need to reduce the concentration of power. You can't make it concentrated into one person. You need to separate it, and that's going to protect the people, protect the rights of the people. All right, so one of the great things about separating the government, our federal government, into three branches is it also allows for checks and balances. So you should recall that all three branches of government are very powerful, and they can each check each other. For example, if we look at this image on the top right, that's a picture of the Capitol building. Capitol building always represents the legislative branch. So for example, the legislative branch is charged with writing laws, and that's what they do. But they don't have 100% power over the laws they give. So they have to send that law to the president in the executive branch for approval. If the president can check the power of the legislative branch by vetoing that legislation. And then it has to get back to the Congress, and the Congress has to override his veto, or the bill is dead, basically. However, if the executive branch gets too powerful, the legislative branch can check the power of the president. So, for example, if the president acts crazy, he's some terrible person doing terrible things, he's a traitor to the country, what have you, the Congress can bring the president up on charges, and not just the president, other members of the government as well. They could also impeach judges in the Supreme Court. But that is one way that the legislative branch can check the power of the president, is to impeach him, to bring him up on charges, and then if they find him guilty, he can lose his job. And as you can see, the judicial branch can check the power of the president by declaring laws unconstitutional, so on and so forth. I mean, you can see the image. Remember, whenever you have a question about checks and balances, you always have to find an action that involves two different branches of the government. It has to be an action that requires something from two different branches of government. So, checks and balances wouldn't include the president naming a member of his own cabinet. That happens inside the executive branch. You get what I'm saying? It has to be something that affects two different branches of government. So some of the big examples of checks and balances are ones right here on this slide. All right, so moving on. Another way the Constitution limits the concentration of power in the government, in addition to splitting power among three different branches of government, it also splits powers between the state and the federal government. Remember, the state government, each state has its own, government. For example, in New York, the head of the state of New York is our governor, right? And that's a whole separate government body. So that's how the state governments run. And then if you refer to the federal government always refers to the national government. That's the government for our country. Our national government is headquartered in Washington, D.C. That's the whole executive, legislative, judicial branch, the Congress, the president, and the Supreme Court. And what happens is these there's some power that's held just by the federal government. There's some power that is held only by the state government, and then some areas where they overlap. This splitting of power, the split of power between the state and the federal/national government, that is known as federalism. Okay, and that's another thing that is found in our Constitution. Our Constitution also involves federalism. So like we said, we have separation of powers in the Constitution. We have checks and balances in the Constitution. Federalism is part of the Constitution. And another thing that the Founding Fathers put into the Constitution was a way to change the Constitution. They said, look, we're going to put together this document, but if something down the road, if people want to make changes to this document, if they decide they need to update it, to do whatever they want to do, if they want to change it, there is a process to change the Constitution. And the process to change the Constitution is called the amendment process, or amending the Constitution. And again, you don't have to get into detail of it, but just know, if you want to change the Constitution, it's a big pain in the butt. It's not an easy thing to do. It's only happened, we only have 27 amendments. So it doesn't happen often, but it is an option. The Constitution can be changed, all right? So, like I said, the Founding Fathers, this is the document they put together. It has all these great principles in it, and they thought, everything was kind of cooking, but still they ran into some problems. They ran into disagreements among the Founding Fathers. One of the big fights that happened over the Constitution was how to determine representation, how states should count, how states should be represented in the federal government. And the big fight was between Virginia, the Virginia plan, and the New Jersey plan. Long story short, Virginia wanted representation based on population because there was a lot of people living in Virginia. New Jersey, which didn't have a big population, it was a relatively small state at the time, it said that instead every state should have equal representation. So this fight back and forth between the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, it was, a real battling back and forth. And so they were able to reach a compromise. And not just any compromise, it was a great compromise. And the great compromise was this, that instead of having a legislature that is only based on population, or a federal legislative branch that is only that has equal representation for each state, they would get both. So what happens is our legislative branch, or otherwise known as Congress, the Congress is made up of two houses. Okay, it is a two-house, or the other word for that, the social studies word for that, is a bicameral. So bicameral, a bicameral legislature. It means a two-house legislature. So the House of Representatives is based on population. The Senate, that's equal. Each state is equally represented by two people. Two people per state serve in the Senate. Okay? And in that way, the great compromise, the compromise between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, this great compromise ensures that the interests of small states and the interests of large states would all be protected, that neither would have too much power, that the small states and large states were all taken care of. All right, so again, we had one more. Okay, so we fixed that one. That we resolved that issue of how to get state representation. But now there's another problem. How are we going to count the population of slave states? As you may recall, or you should know, most of the people living in the South were really not considered people in any meaningful way, because naturally most of the people living in the South were slaves. They were enslaved. And so you would think, well, you treat these people like property, clearly they wouldn't count towards population. But other people women were counted as part of the population, and we didn't have much rights either. I mean, we weren't slaves, don't get me wrong, but at least white women. Women were counted towards population. They didn't have a right to vote. So anyway, there was another compromise that was struck. And this compromise is known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. Okay, so this was the second compromise that goes into the Constitution. And this one said that all of the white people who are in a given state would be counted one for one. If you have 5 white people, all 5 count. But if your state has slaves in it, you don't count each and every slave. They will only count 3 out of every 5 slaves towards population. Okay, so only 3 out of 5 slaves will be counted towards population. And this gives it the name, the Three-Fifths Compromise. As a result of the Three-Fifths Compromise, slave states will get additional congressional representation. So they will get more representation based on, because the slave population, a very, very large slave population in the southern states, would count to give them more representation in the House of Representatives. All right, so we understand the principles that exist within the Constitution. We've been able to strike 2 different compromises, get the document, to get everybody on board, but still people are not completely happy with this document. What develops are basically 2 opposing camps. One group of people who love the Constitution and one group who hate the Constitution. And they are known as the Federalists. Federalists love the Constitution as is. They think, look, we did all this great stuff. We're going to protect everybody's rights with federalism and separation of powers and checks and balances. And this document is great. We should approve it. And the anti-federalists, they are against this document. They are very afraid of a strong federal government. They say this Constitution makes the federal government too strong. We should have something more like the Articles of Confederation. We need a weak central government. This is a terrible thing. This Constitution does not do enough to protect people's civil liberties. So you should remember, civil liberty is your personal freedom. And again, like I said, they thought that the central government, the federal government, was way too strong and powerful. That was their two main issues with the Constitution. And it looked like we were having another big problem. But again, a compromise was reached. And with this compromise, the Federalists said, okay, you're worried about people's civil liberties, you're worried about people's personal freedoms. We got the fix. We will add a Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is basically the first 10 amendments. Remember earlier I told you there's a way to change the Constitution. There's always a way to fix the Constitution. You can amend the Constitution. That's a way you change the document. So basically, they changed the document. The first 10 amendments are all designed to protect people's personal freedoms and their political rights. That is what the first 10 amendments are designed to do. And like I said, there's only 27 amendments, period, in the whole, in the history of the country. So this is, a little less than half of them, are the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights, as well as a lot of the other ones, most of the other ones, are really all designed, again, to protect people's freedom and political rights. Okay, and with that, we get the Constitution approved, and we are rolling as a brand new country. So you are done with this video. Move on to the next.